The signal came from nowhere. Rail was running his third navigation check of the shift when the console picked it up. A thin, broken thread of sound cutting through the static of deep space. It was not loud. It was barely anything at all. But it was repeating and it was structured, and that meant it was not natural. He almost ignored it. The drifting Thorn was 3 days out from the Verath shipping lanes, hauling compressed ore and medical dry goods for a mid-rim colony that probably did not care when the shipment arrived. The crew was small, 6 bodies, including himself. Nobody was paid enough to go chasing ghost signals in uncharted directions. But Rail was a navigator, and navigators did not ignore structured signals. He pulled the frequency up on his secondary screen and let the system run a match search. It came back in seconds. One result. The match confidence was listed at 91%, which was high enough to be meaningful. The frequency was cataloged in the Galactic Archive under a single label, Human Emergency Band. Status listed, inactive. Last confirmed use, 287 years ago. Rail sat with that information for a long moment. Then he went to find Buru. The young Shaleth engineer was in the lower maintenance corridor, his damp skin catching the pale light as he ran diagnostics on the secondary coolant lines. His wide amber eyes blinked slowly when Rail showed him the screen. Buru was the youngest crew member by a significant margin, and he had a habit of reading things that nobody else bothered to read, which made him useful in moments like this. "Humans," Buru said, reading the label twice. "You know the name." "I know the stories." Buru handed the screen back. "Everyone knows the stories. They are not good stories." Rail agreed. The stories about humans were the kind told to explain why certain records were sealed and certain systems were left off star charts. A species that had burned bright and fast, violent, unpredictable, gone. The galactic consensus when anyone bothered to form one was that humans had collapsed under the weight of their own chaos somewhere around 3 centuries ago. There were no confirmed sightings, no diplomatic contact, no signal traffic, nothing. Until now. They brought it to Captain Ozan together. The Velhari captain was at his usual place near the cargo manifest screens, his scaled jaw working slowly as he reviewed weight distributions. He listened to Rail explain without interrupting, which meant he was actually interested. "Dead frequency," Ozan said when Rail finished. "Yes." "Broadcasting a distress pattern. A repeating structured signal. It matches the old distress format." Ozan was quiet for a moment. Salvage rights on an unclaimed system go to the first registered vessel to file a contact report. Rail had expected this reasoning. It was the same reasoning that got crews into trouble across every shipping lane in the Outer Rim. But the math was real, and Ozan was not wrong. If there was something out there worth filing on, the profit margins on this run would look very small by comparison. The course change was filed 20 minutes later. Buru spent the travel time in the archive room, pulling every record the galactic database had on humans. It was not much. Most of the early contact files were fragmentary, trade logs, a few diplomatic exchanges from roughly 4 centuries back. Then, abruptly, nothing. The records did not trail off the way extinction records usually did, with population decline data and last observed contact reports. They simply stopped, as if someone had drawn a line. He found one sealed file marker with a council stamp on it. The stamp was old but readable. It bore the phrase, "restricted by mutual agreement." He had never seen that language on a seal before. Extinctions were not sealed by mutual agreement. They were just documented. He was still thinking about that when the drifting Thorn dropped out of faster-than-light travel, and the view screen filled with ships. Not one, not a dozen. Hundreds. They sat in formation across the dark space of an unnamed system, arranged in overlapping arcs that suggested not just military discipline but long practice. These were not ships thrown together in a hurry. They were uniform. They were maintained. Running lights moved along their hulls in slow pulses like breathing. The drifting thorn went completely silent. Rail realized after a moment that the silence was the crew. Every person on board had stopped moving. The ships did not react. They did not power weapons. They did not hail. They simply continued their slow, deliberate movement through the system, holding formation the way a school of creatures holds formation in deep water, without apparent effort, without apparent thought, as if they had been doing it for a very long time. Burrow appeared in the doorway of the bridge. His skin had gone pale, which meant he was frightened. "The sealed file," he said quietly. "I think I understand the language now." Rail looked at him. "Restricted by mutual agreement." Burrow's voice was steady but small. "That means both sides agreed to seal it. That means the other side still existed when it was sealed." The comm panel lit up. An incoming signal, broad frequency, directed specifically at the drifting thorn. Rail answered it. The voice on the other end was calm. It spoke in Galactic Standard without an accent, which meant it had been practicing for a very long time. It said 4 words before the channel went quiet again. "We have been waiting." Nobody on the drifting thorn slept that night. They sat in the dark of a star system that appeared on no current chart, surrounded by a fleet of hundreds of ships that had not moved against them, and waited to understand what they had found. Rail kept the comm line open on a low carrier wave, just enough to show the other side that they were still there and still listening. No further message came. The human fleet simply held its position, patient as stone. Burrow did not stop reading. He had found a way into the older archive layers, the ones that required a research license most cargo crews did not bother to maintain. The drifting thorn had won because Captain Ozzen occasionally dealt in route finding for uncharted systems, and that kind of work required access to historical survey data. Burrow used it now to go deeper than the surface records had allowed. What he found changed the shape of everything he thought he knew. The human records did not stop because humans had died. They stopped because, 280 years ago, a formal request had been submitted to the Galactic Council by a human diplomatic vessel asking that all active records, trade files, and communication logs pertaining to human space be sealed from public access. The Council had agreed. The agreement was listed as voluntary on both sides. The reason given in the filing was 3 words: time to heal. Burrow read that phrase several times. Then he read the documents surrounding it. The picture that emerged was incomplete but clear enough. Humans had not collapsed. They had experienced something enormous, something their own records described with a kind of careful understatement that suggested the people writing them were still too close to it to look at it directly. Their words spoke of a conflict that had not been fought against another species. It had been fought among themselves. A fracture that had run across their entire civilization, leaving damage so wide and deep that they had made a collective decision. Stop. Step back. Disappear from the galactic stage entirely and deal with what they had become before they became anything else. It was not retreat. Burrow understood that now. It was surgery. He brought the summary to Rail just before the long cycle of ship night ended. Rail read it slowly, standing at the nav console with the fleet still visible on the forward sensors. "They chose to leave," Rail said. "They chose to be ready before they came back," Burrow said. "Those are different things." Rail looked at the fleet. In the sensor display, the ships moved in their slow formation arcs. He had been watching them long enough now to notice something. The pattern was not random and it was not purely military. Some of the larger vessels held steady in the center of the formation, while smaller ships moved in regular rotations around them. He had seen that kind of movement before, in colony fleets, in groups of ships that were carrying not just crew but populations. "There are families on those ships," he said. Burrow nodded. "I think they have been out here for a very long time." Before either of them could say anything else, a single vessel separated from the human fleet. It was mid-sized, nothing remarkable in its construction, but it moved with a smoothness that spoke of very well-maintained engines. It came toward the drifting Thorn on a direct line, unhurried, and stopped at a distance that was close enough for easy communication but far enough to not be threatening. Then it broadcast a short message, not on the carrier wave rail had left open, but on a standard council-recognized contact frequency, the kind used for first meetings. The message was an invitation. "Come aboard, we will answer your questions." Captain Ozin, who had been quiet through most of the night, spoke from behind them both. "What are the chances this is a trap?" Rail considered. "Low. If they wanted to take this ship, they have had hours to do it, and they have several hundred reasons not to need our cargo." "What do they want with us?" "I think," Burrow said slowly, "we are the first people who have come looking." Ozin chewed on that for a moment. The Velhari captain was not a sentimental being, but he was a practical one, and practical beings understood that some opportunities did not repeat themselves. He straightened, rolled the tension from his shoulders, and turned toward the docking controls. "Tell them 3 of us are coming over," he said. "And tell them we want to understand why a civilization that vanished 3 centuries ago is sitting in an unmarked system with enough ships to make the council nervous." Burrow sent the reply. The response came back in seconds, one word: "Good." They crossed in a small transit pod, the 3 of them watching the human ship grow large in the small forward window. Up close it was different than on sensors. There were marks on the hull, not damage, but something else. Long streaks of color, painted in patterns that wound around the hull plating in ways that served no military function at all. Someone had painted those marks because they wanted to, because the ship meant something to them beyond its function. Burrow pressed his hand against the window glass as they drew alongside. "They decorated it," he said very quietly. Rail said nothing. The docking clamps engaged with a soft sound, and the airlock opened, and warm light came through from the other side. The first thing Rail noticed was the sound. Ships had their own sounds. Every crew learned them: the hum of the drive system, the settle of the hull under pressure, the particular noise that recycled air made moving through different grades of ducting. Rail had been on enough vessels to read a ship by its sound the way some read a face. The human ship sounded lived in, deeply, long-term lived in. It sounded like a place where people had been born and grown old and made decisions and disagreed and cooked food and raised children for several generations. The corridors were clean and well lit, but the walls had things on them. Not military markings, drawings, writing in a script Rail did not recognize. Small framed objects mounted at intervals that he could not immediately identify. As they were led through the main passage, he passed an alcove where 3 small children stopped their game and stared at the visitors with enormous curious eyes. One of them waved. Burrow waved back without thinking. The child grinned. Their guide was a woman named Sira. She introduced herself in perfect galactic standard and walked ahead of them at an easy pace, not rushing, not performing any kind of formal welcome ceremony. She answered questions as they walked, which Rail found immediately useful and also slightly disorienting because he had not asked any questions yet. "The marks on the hull are a tradition from our 3rd generation of ships," she said, as if she had heard his thought. "Every family aboard paints a section of their section's hull plate during the annual cycle. It started as a morale practice during the early withdrawal years. Now it is just something we do." "How many people are on the ship?" Burrow asked. "This one, around 4,000. The fleet total is closer to 11 million. Captain Ozin made a sound that Rail had never heard him make before. It was somewhere between surprise and reluctant respect. Sira brought them to a meeting room. It was simple, with a long table and chairs that had been built for bodies of different sizes, which suggested they had been designed with guests in mind long before today. She sat across from them and folded her hands, and looked at all three of them with the calm of someone who had been rehearsing for this meeting for years. "You have questions," she said. "Ask them." Rail started with the most direct one. "Why now?" "Because the Keth Dominion has been expanding for 40 years and they are no longer being subtle about it." She slid a data tablet across the table. "We have been watching from outside the mapped lanes. Colony absorption, resource extraction, population displacement. The Council has filed 17 formal concerns in that period. None have produced action. 3 weeks ago, the Keth moved a primary war fleet to within strike range of the Verath shipping corridor." Rail looked at the data. It was detailed, precise. The kind of data that came from long observation, not quick intelligence gathering. "You have been watching the inner systems," he said. "We never fully stopped. We withdrew our presence. We did not withdraw our attention." She paused. "We made mistakes 3 centuries ago, large ones, the kind that take a long time to understand and longer to correct. We did not come back until we were certain we understood them. That took time, more time than we expected." Burrow had been quiet, reading the tablet. He looked up. "What changed? What made you certain you were ready?" Sierra was still for a moment. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It felt like the silence of someone choosing words with care because the words mattered. "We built a process," she said. "Every major decision in our fleet requires a specific kind of review. Before we act, we ask 4 questions. Who is harmed by this action? Who is helped? What does this cost the ones who oppose us? And what does this cost us?" She turned her hands over on the table. When we could answer all 4 questions honestly without flinching from the answers, we knew we were ready. Ozan leaned forward. "And the answer to those questions brought you back here, to pick a fight with the Keth Dominion." "The answer brought us back here to give the species in that corridor the chance to survive what is coming. The Keth do not need us to start this war. They have already started it. We are offering to end it before it becomes something the inner systems cannot recover from." The room was quiet for a moment. Rail thought about the fleet outside. Hundreds of ships, 11 million people, 3 centuries of preparation in an unmarked system. These were not people who had drifted back into galactic space on a whim. They had come back the way a person returns to a hard conversation they know they cannot avoid, not with anger, but with the quiet resolve of someone who has thought it through completely. He looked at Sierra. "You said you could end it. How?" "We have studied the Keth for 2 decades, their fleet tactics, their command structure, their economic pressure points, their internal politics." She stood and moved to the display on the far wall. A map of the inner systems appeared with Keth fleet positions marked. "They are disciplined and they are strong, but they have never fought anything like us." Burrow stared at the map. "Because they think you are a myth." Sierra smiled. It was a small, careful smile. "That gives us about 3 days of surprise. We intend to use them well." She turned back to the table. "But the Council will not accept our presence without a verified report from a neutral registered vessel. They will call us a fabrication otherwise." Her eyes moved to Ozan. "You are registered." Ozan sat with that for a long time. Then he straightened in his chair. "What do you need us to say?" "The truth," Sierra said. "That is always enough." The Galactic Council had not changed in 3 centuries. That was not a compliment. Rail understood this more clearly now than he ever had before as he stood in the gallery of the main chamber on Verath Prime and watched the delegates argue about the definition of a verified signal. The chamber was enormous. Curved walls of pale stone rose 3 stories high, broken by tall windows that looked out onto the capital's upper levels. 43 species were represented by delegates sitting in tiered arcs around a central floor. The acoustics were designed to make every voice carry equally. In practice, the loudest voices still dominated, and the loudest voice today belonged to Counselor Deva. Deva was old and sharp and had spent 40 years building a reputation for steady, careful governance. What that meant in practice, Rail had come to understand. was that Deva was very good at finding reasons not to act on things that were politically inconvenient. Rail had presented the data. Buru had supported it with the archive findings. Captain Ozan had provided the vessel registration and the formal first contact filing, which was legally binding and could not be easily dismissed. Deva had spent 40 minutes dismissing it anyway. The signal source is unverified, Deva said, for the third time, in the practiced tone of someone who knew that repetition built weight. The fleet, if it exists as described, has not submitted to any council identification protocol. The archive records cited by this crew are from sealed files that were sealed for documented reasons. We do not unseal documents because a cargo crew decided to follow an unusual signal. The documents were sealed by mutual agreement, Buru said from beside Rail. His voice was steady. Rail had noticed that Buru had become steadier since the visit to the human ship, as if something had settled in him. Mutual agreement requires two parties. The second party is currently sitting in an unmarked system waiting for this body to respond to the data we have provided. Assuming the data is genuine. The data includes Keth fleet positions that match independently filed route warnings from 4 separate shipping companies over the past 2 years. We are not asking the Council to believe in humans. We are asking the Council to look at where the Keth fleet is and ask itself what they plan to do with it. Deva shifted. Rail watched other delegates shift with him. The movement was subtle but readable. Some of them had already looked at the Keth position data. Some of them had been looking at it for longer than they wanted to admit. Councillor Wint, who represented the Shaleth Elder delegation, had not spoken. Wint was very old enough that his skin had taken on the deep blue-gray tone of the very aged among his species. He sat in his tier with his long hands folded and his eyes moving between the central floor and the data screen beside him. During the recess, he found Buru in the corridor outside the gallery. He did not offer a greeting. He looked at Buru the way an old teacher looks at a student who has found a book they were not expecting to find. "You read the sealed files," Wint said. "Enough of them. I was a junior aide during the sealing. I was not important enough for anyone to worry about what I understood." He paused. "They were not sealed because humans were dangerous. They were sealed because the Council was afraid of what humans represented." Buru waited. A species that looked at itself clearly enough to stop, to choose healing over expansion, to come back only when it was ready. Wint's voice was very low. That terrified certain members of this body more than any fleet would have, because it asked a question they did not want to answer about themselves. He returned to the chamber before Buru could respond. The session reconvened. Deva was midway through proposing a committee to study the first contact filing when the chamber's emergency alert system activated. The sound was not loud, but it cut through everything. 3 colonial border stations had stopped transmitting simultaneously. The communications officer on the chamber floor confirmed it in a flat, careful voice. Vereth Colony Dresh, Outpost Hallen, and the trade station Myert Cross. All dark, all within the Keth's projected strike range. The chamber did not erupt immediately. There was a moment of very complete silence, the kind that came when a large group of intelligent beings all arrived at the same understanding at the same time. Then it erupted. Deva was no longer speaking about committees. Several delegates were on their feet. The communications officer was fielding 3 simultaneous channels. Someone from the Torathi delegation was asking about military response protocols that had not been reviewed in 60 years because there had been no reason to review them. Rail stood in the gallery and felt the particular cold of watching something he had expected actually happen. Buru appeared beside him. "No coordinated response," he said quietly. "They do not have one." No, they never needed one. Across the chamber floor, a junior communications aide pushed through to Deva's position and handed him a written note. Deva read it. His expression did not change much, but his posture did. He stood slightly differently afterward, the way a being stands when a decision has been taken out of their hands. He opened a channel. His voice, when it came over the speaker, was the voice of a politician who had run out of room. "Connect me to the registered vessel filing, the one from the cargo crew." A pause. "And open a broad channel to whatever frequency those ships are using." The response came before the channel was even confirmed as open. Admiral Doss's voice was exactly what Rael had expected from the brief glimpse he had gotten aboard the human vessel. Calm, unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who had been carrying weight for a very long time. "We are already moving," Doss said. "We began moving yesterday. We assumed this would happen." Deva stared at the speaker, as if it had said something in a language he was still learning. "You anticipated this." "We have been watching the Keth for 20 years, Doss said. "They are very predictable once you understand them. We are at the first colony in 6 hours. We suggest you prepare medical and resettlement resources. There will be displaced civilians." The channel held for a moment. Then Doss added, without any particular emphasis, "We will take care of the rest." Rael watched the battle from a Council observer vessel, and he did not understand what he was seeing for the first 20 minutes. He understood battles. He had grown up near the Torathi border skirmishes, and he had spent enough years on cargo runs through contested space to know what a fight looked like on sensors. Ships closed. Weapons discharged. One side broke and ran or was destroyed. It was brutal and it was simple, and it followed patterns that had not changed significantly across 3 centuries of intermittent galactic conflict. The human fleet did not follow those patterns. When they arrived at Dresh Colony, the Keth ships were already in orbit and beginning their standard consolidation procedure, which involved disabling the colony's communication array first and its power grid second. It was efficient. Rael had read enough of the data from the Thorn's archive access to know the Keth had done this many times before. The human fleet came out of faster-than-light travel not in a single grouped mass, but in a distributed formation that spread across 3 approach vectors simultaneously. The Keth reacted as expected, pulling into a defensive cluster. What happened next was not expected. The humans did not fire at the main Keth formation. They fired at the colony's destroyed communication array, and the shots were not weapons fire. They were repair drones, launched at high velocity, that attached to the damaged array and began reconstruction in real time. While the Keth were watching their sensors try to make sense of incoming contacts that were neither weapons nor ships, the colony's communication grid came back online. Rael stared at his display. They fixed the array first. Beside him, a Council military observer named Pell made a sound that suggested she was also recalculating her understanding of the situation. The Keth commander recovered and ordered a strike on the human lead ships. The strike connected. 3 human vessels took significant hits. They did not return fire with maximum force. They returned what looked on sensors like targeted minimal pulse bursts aimed specifically at Keth weapon systems. Not engines, not hulls, just the weapons. "They are trying to disarm them," Pell said. "Yes. That is not efficient." Rael thought about Sierra's voice in the meeting room. The 4 questions, who is harmed? "No," he said, "it is not efficient, it is something else." The battle for Dresh Colony lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, the Keth fleet was not destroyed. It was stopped. Ships drifting, weapons offline, drives intact enough for the crew to survive. Human rescue teams were already moving to collect escape pods before the last Keth weapon went quiet. They were collecting Keth escape pods. Pell had stopped narrating her observations. She simply watched. Rael sent a short message to Buru, who was still on Vareth Prime with Captain Ozan. He kept the message simple. They are treating the enemy wounded alongside the colonists they attacked. Buru's response came back in 2 words: "I know." The pattern repeated at Hallan Outpost. The human fleet arrived, distributed, non-linear, reading the battlefield before committing to any single engagement. They used electronic interference to confuse Keth targeting systems while simultaneously restoring the outpost's power grid. 2 human ships took serious structural damage. Their crew continued operating. One ship had a full breach in a secondary section. Rail watched the sensor data and saw the vessel hold formation regardless, adapting its role to compensate for the damage. He found himself thinking about what 3 centuries of preparation looked like in practice. It looked like this: ships that kept functioning when they were hurt, crews that kept thinking when it was loud and frightening, and the easier choice was to stop thinking and just destroy things. The hardest situation was the 3rd location. Myart Cross Trade Station had a mixed population, colonists and workers, and a small Keth garrison that had apparently not expected anyone to respond this quickly. By the time the human ships arrived, the garrison commander, an officer named Grath, had retreated his forces into the station's central hub and was refusing contact. Sierra took the channel herself. Rail could hear the transmission from the observer vessel. He did not know what he expected her to say. Threats, perhaps, terms, a countdown. That was what military commanders did when a cornered opponent refused to surrender. Sierra said none of those things. She told Grath, plainly and without drama, exactly what was going to happen to his crew if the fighting continued. Not as a threat, as information. She described the positions of the ships surrounding the station. She explained the options remaining and how long each would take. Then she told him what she was offering: full treatment for any wounded on his side, transport back to Keth space for any crew member who wanted to go, and formal documentation of the garrison's surrender that would be filed with both the Council and the Keth Dominion to confirm that no Keth life had been taken unnecessarily. She was giving him a way to stop that he could defend to his own people. Grath took 11 minutes to respond. Then he opened his channel and said he was standing down. The station came back online within the hour. Keth and colonist wounded were treated in the same medical bay, side by side, because there was only one medical bay and the humans had not thought to separate them. A human medic worked on a Keth soldier's injuries with the same focus she applied to the colonist beside him. Rail saw the image on the observer vessel's feed, and he sat quietly for a very long time afterward. By the end of the day, the Keth Dominion filed for ceasefire talks. Rail sent his final update to the Drifting Thorn with one line: "They are real. I did not understand what that meant until now. I think I do." He looked at the stars outside the observer vessel's window. The human fleet was holding position, not advancing, not retreating, just present, waiting to see if the ceasefire would hold. He thought it probably would. 3 months after the ceasefire, Buru was given a room on Vareth Prime that smelled like old paper and had no windows. He did not mind, he had asked for it. The room was part of the Council Archive facility, a section that had been opened only twice in the past century, and was now opened a 3rd time by a formal vote of 31 to 12, with 9 abstentions. The vote had been longer and louder than it needed to be, but it had passed, and that was what mattered. The sealed human records were now accessible for official review and public cataloging. Buru had volunteered for the task before anyone else could think to ask him. He started with the oldest files. He had expected military records, battle reports, the kind of documents that explained why a civilization had nearly destroyed itself and then made a drastic choice. Those records existed. He found them. They were not hidden, just filed in chronological order alongside everything else, because the humans had apparently decided that what they had done was something to be understood rather than concealed. What surprised him was everything around those records. For every document about a conflict, there were 20 about what came after it. Rebuilding plans, accountability frameworks, long, detailed arguments between people who disagreed about how to move forward and how to structure things so the same mistakes could not be made as easily again. There were records of votes and of arguments and of times when the process broke down and had to be restarted. There were records of people being very wrong and then saying so out loud, in writing, in documents that were kept rather than destroyed. There were also records from the generation ships during the withdrawal years, personal accounts, family histories, descriptions of daily life, children's drawings saved in the archive alongside formal policy documents, a 300-year record of a civilization living inside its own decision and doing the work that decision required, one day at a time. Burrow read for 6 weeks. He brought summaries to Counselor Wint every few days. The old Shaleth delegate would take the summaries home and read them and come back with questions that were never the questions Burrow expected. Wint did not ask about weapons capacity or fleet size or military doctrine. He asked about the children. He asked about the schools on the generation ships. He asked about the disagreements and how they had been resolved. He asked about the 4 questions that Sira had mentioned. "They are not a process," Wint said one afternoon, holding a summary in his long hands. "They are a habit. They practiced it until it became a habit." "Yes," Burrow said, "for 3 centuries." Wint was quiet for a while. "I wonder if we could learn it." Burrow did not have an answer for that. He thought it was the most important question anyone in the council building had asked since this had all begun. The Keth ceasefire held. The internal political situation within the Keth Dominion was shifting in ways that the Council's Intelligence Bureau had not predicted and could not fully explain. What had leaked out through diplomatic channels was that the news of how Keth prisoners and wounded soldiers had been treated during the conflict was circulating internally, and it was changing conversations that had previously been closed. It was hard to sustain the argument that a species was your enemy when their medics had worked through the night on your injured soldiers, without being asked. Rail returned to the Drifting Thorn after his council observer duty concluded. Burrow heard from him occasionally, short messages, route updates, a dry observation about shipping rates. Once, Rail sent a single line that said only, "The archive listing for the human emergency band frequency has been updated. It no longer says inactive. Someone changed it to open." Burrow read that message 3 times and then saved it to his personal files. On the last day of his official cataloging assignment, Burrow found the document he would think about for the rest of his life. It was not filed under anything important. It had been included in a batch of personal writings from the early withdrawal years, tagged as informal and listed under miscellaneous correspondence. It was short, written in the kind of plain language people used when they were writing to someone they trusted, not for an archive. The writer described what it felt like to leave, the weight of it, the way the stars looked different when you knew you were going away from everything familiar and into a long silence that you had chosen. And then, near the end, there was a line that someone had apparently passed through the generation ships during the hardest years. Not an official motto, not a formal statement, just something people said to each other when the process was slow and the work was heavy and the return seemed very far away. Burrow read it carefully, then he read it again. He opened a new entry in the public Galactic Archive, the one that was now accessible to any registered species with a library license, and he typed the words into the record under the Human Historical Collection. He tagged it as culturally significant and noted its original context and left it there where anyone could find it. The line said, "We are not going anywhere, we are just getting ready." Burrow closed his files, put on his coat, and walked out of the windowless room into the open corridors of Verath Prime. Above the capital, the sky was the pale amber color it turned in late afternoon, and ships moved quietly in the upper lanes. And somewhere in unmarked space, a fleet of 11 million people was holding its position and watching and waiting. He thought about that child who had waved at him through the airlock corridor. He waved at nothing in particular, just at the open sky, and went home.